She had given up on her healing gift after her husband's death, but when a dying Inuit hunter appeared at her door, everything she thought she knew about second chances was proven wrong. This is the story of Dr. Elisabeth Harper, whose broken heart learned to heal again by saving the life of a stranger. Dr. Elisabeth Harper knelt beside the small grave behind her cabin, placing fresh wildflowers on the wooden marker that bore her husband's name. 3 years had passed since Thomas Harper died in her arms. Despite all her medical training, all her years of studying both traditional and modern healing methods, all her desperate attempts to save the one person who mattered most to her. The irony was not lost on her. For 15 years, Elizabeth had been known throughout the Northern Territories as the doctor who could work miracles. Settlers and native peoples alike had traveled hundreds of miles to seek her help, drawn by stories of her uncanny ability to diagnose ailments that baffled other physicians and heal injuries that should have been fatal. She had combined her formal medical education with traditional remedies learned from Inuit healers, creating a hybrid approach that seemed to tap into something beyond ordinary skill or knowledge. But when Thomas contracted the fever that swept through their settlement in the winter of 1897, all of Elizabeth's abilities had proved worthless. She had tried everything: modern medicines, traditional herbs, prayers, and desperate bargains with whatever forces might be listening. Nothing had worked. The man who had believed in her gift more than she believed in it herself had died while she held his hand, leaving her to face the terrible truth that all her supposed power meant nothing when it mattered most. The settlement of Whitehorse had tried to convince Elizabeth to continue practicing medicine after Thomas's death. The people needed her skills, they argued, and surely the loss of one patient, even her beloved husband, didn't negate all the lives she had saved over the years. But Elizabeth could no longer bear the weight of others' hopes and trust. Every time someone looked at her with expectation in their eyes, she remembered the way Thomas had looked at her during his final hours, still believing she would find a way to save him even as the life drained from his body. So she had packed her few possessions and moved to this isolated cabin on the shore of Lake Bennett, 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. Here, surrounded by the wilderness that had always been her greatest source of peace, she tried to build a life that didn't require her to disappoint anyone else. She grew her own food, trapped small game for meat, and spent her days in activities that had nothing to do with healing or helping or saving lives that might slip through her fingers. The medical supplies that had once filled her home now sat unused in a single trunk, covered by dust and cobwebs. Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to throw them away. They represented too many years of study and practice, but she also couldn't bear to look at them.
They were reminders of a version of herself that no longer existed. A woman who had believed she could hold death at bay through knowledge and determination and love. On this particular morning in late autumn, as Elizabeth knelt beside Thomas's grave, she was thinking about the approaching winter and the preparations she still needed to make. The nights were already growing bitter cold, and soon the lake would freeze solid, cutting off even the possibility of occasional contact with the outside world. She had enough supplies to last until spring, enough books to occupy her mind, and enough memories of Thomas to keep her company during the long, dark months ahead. It was as she was rising to return to her cabin that she heard the sound, a low moaning that seemed to come from the direction of the lake. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but there was something unmistakably human about the sound, something that spoke of pain and desperation that she recognized from too many years of treating patients. Elizabeth tried to ignore it. Whatever was happening down by the lakeshore was no longer her concern. She had left the business of healing behind when she buried Thomas, and she had no intention of taking it up again. But the moaning continued, rising and falling in a rhythm that suggested someone was in serious distress. Despite her resolve to remain uninvolved, Elizabeth found her feet carrying her toward the sound. Her medical training was too deeply ingrained to allow her to simply ignore obvious suffering, even though every instinct warned her against getting involved. As she made her way through the trees that separated her cabin from the lakeshore, the moaning grew louder and more distinct, accompanied now by the sound of labored breathing. She found him collapsed at the edge of the frozen lake, barely conscious and obviously near death. He was an Inuit hunter, dressed in traditional sealskin clothing that was torn and bloodied from what appeared to be an encounter with a large predator. His left shoulder and arm bore deep claw marks that were already showing signs of infection, and his breathing was shallow and irregular in a way that suggested internal injuries. But it was his face that stopped Elisabeth cold. Even unconscious and ravaged by pain and fever, he possessed a kind of quiet strength that reminded her powerfully of Thomas. Not in appearance, this man's features were distinctly native, with high cheekbones and dark skin weathered by years of Arctic exposure, but in the sense of fundamental decency that seemed to radiate from him, even in his current condition. Elisabeth's first instinct was to turn away. This man was clearly beyond help, and involving herself in his situation would only lead to the familiar agony of watching someone die despite her best efforts. She had endured that pain once with Thomas, and she wasn't strong enough to experience it again with a stranger. But as she started to walk away, the hunter's eyes fluttered open, and he looked directly at her.
There was no plea in his gaze, no demand for help, just a calm acceptance of his situation, and perhaps the faintest flicker of curiosity about the white woman who had appeared at his moment of greatest need. What would you do if you had given up your calling after a devastating failure, only to be confronted with someone whose life depended on the very skills you'd abandoned? "Please," he whispered in heavily accented English, his voice barely audible. "My daughter." The words hit Elisabeth like a physical blow. This dying man wasn't thinking about himself. He was worried about someone else, someone who depended on him. The parallels to her own situation with Thomas were too obvious to ignore, and despite all her resolve, Elisabeth found herself kneeling beside the injured hunter. "Where is your daughter?" she asked, already beginning to assess his injuries with the automatic efficiency of someone who had examined thousands of patients. "Alone. Winter coming," he managed to say before a coughing fit interrupted him. Blood flecked his lips, confirming Elisabeth's suspicion that he had internal injuries, in addition to the obvious external wounds. Elisabeth closed her eyes, fighting an internal battle that threatened to tear her apart. Every rational consideration told her to walk away. This man was too badly injured to save, especially without proper medical facilities. Trying to help him would only result in another failure, another death on her conscience, another confirmation that her supposed healing gift was nothing more than self-deception. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she could hear Thomas's voice reminding her of the oath she had taken when she first began practicing medicine. First, do no harm. And surely abandoning a dying man when she had the knowledge and supplies to at least attempt treatment was a form of harm, regardless of the likely outcome. "Can you walk?" she asked, though she could already see that he couldn't. The hunter shook his head slightly, the effort obviously causing him significant pain. "Then I'll have to get you to my cabin," Elisabeth said, more to herself than to him. "This is probably going to be the stupidest thing I've done in 3 years." Getting the injured hunter from the lake shore to her cabin proved to be an ordeal that tested every ounce of Elisabeth's strength and determination. He was a large man, powerfully built, despite his current condition, and the quarter-mile distance felt like several miles as she half-carried, half-dragged him through the forest. Several times she was certain he had died during the journey, only to feel the faint flutter of his pulse when she checked for signs of life. By the time they reached her cabin, Elisabeth was exhausted, and the hunter was completely unconscious. She managed to get him onto her kitchen table, the only surface large enough to serve as an examination area, and began the process of assessing the full extent of his injuries. What she found was worse than she had initially thought. The claw marks on his shoulder and arm were deep and badly infected, suggesting that the attack had occurred several days earlier. His left shoulder blade was fractured, and at least 2 ribs were broken. But most serious of all, he was showing signs of blood poisoning that had advanced to a life-threatening stage. Elisabeth stared down at the unconscious man, her mind automatically cataloging the treatments that would be necessary to save his life.
She would need to clean and suture the wounds, set the broken bones, and somehow combat the infection that was systematically poisoning his system. Even with modern medical facilities and a full staff of trained assistants, his chances of survival would be slim. In her isolated cabin, with only her own skills and whatever supplies she had on hand, his chances were virtually non-existent. "This is insane," she said aloud, as much to hear her own voice as to express her doubts. "I can't save him. I couldn't even save Thomas, and he didn't have half these injuries." But even as she spoke the words, Elisabeth was moving toward the trunk that contained her medical supplies. Dust flew up in clouds as she opened it for the first time in 3 years, revealing the instruments and medicines she had once used with such confidence. Her hands trembled as she lifted out her surgical kit, remembering the last time she had used these tools in a desperate attempt to save her husband's life. The first step was to clean the wounds and assess them properly. Elisabeth heated water and gathered her supplies, trying to push away the memories of other patients, other desperate situations where life and death had hung in the balance. As she began to work, she was surprised to discover that her hands still remembered the precise movements, the careful techniques that had once been as natural as breathing. The hunter's injuries were even more severe than she had initially realized. The animal that had attacked him, based on the claw marks, she guessed it had been a large bear, had done massive damage to the muscle and tissue in his shoulder. Several major blood vessels had been severed and had healed improperly, creating a network of scar tissue that was impeding circulation and contributing to the infection. Elisabeth worked for hours, cleaning and suturing, setting bones and administering what medicines she had available to combat the infection. As she worked, she found herself talking to the unconscious man, partly to keep herself calm and partly because some instinct told her that the sound of a human voice might help anchor his spirit to his body. "You're going to survive this," she told him as she carefully cleaned the deepest of his wounds. "I don't know why I'm so sure of that, but I am. You're strong, stronger than most people I've treated, and you have something to live for. Your daughter. That matters more than you might think." As the night wore on, Elisabeth discovered something she hadn't expected. Working to save this man's life was awakening something in her that had been dormant since Thomas's death. The familiar rhythm of diagnosis and treatment, the careful balance of knowledge and intuition that effective healing required, felt like coming home after a long and painful exile. But more than that, she was beginning to sense something unusual about her patient. As she worked on his injuries, she became aware of a kind of energy or presence that seemed to emanate from him, something that made her healing touch more effective than it had been in years. Wounds that should have taken days to show improvement were healing visibly under her hands. Infections that should have required weeks of treatment were responding to her ministrations in hours. By dawn, the hunter's fever had broken and his breathing had stabilized. The worst of his wounds were showing clear signs of healing, and the dangerous pallor that had marked his face when she first found him was being replaced by a healthier color. Elisabeth had seen many recoveries in her years of practice, but nothing quite like this. It was as the first light of morning was filtering through her cabin windows that the hunter opened his eyes and looked at her with full consciousness for the first time. "You saved my life," he said simply, his voice stronger than she had expected. "I treated your injuries," Elisabeth replied, suddenly feeling awkward about the gratitude in his eyes. "Your own strength did the rest." The hunter studied her face with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was seeing more than most people would notice. "You are a healer, but you carry great sadness. Someone you loved died, and you blame yourself." Elisabeth was startled by the accuracy of his observation. Might people understand the connection between healer and patient?" he said gently. "I felt your pain as you worked to heal mine. You have been punishing yourself for something that was not your fault." "You don't know what you're talking about," Elisabeth said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I know that the man you loved would not want you to abandon your gift because of his death," the hunter continued. "I know that you saved my life not just with your medicines and your skill, but with something deeper, a power that comes from understanding suffering." Elisabeth turned away from his perceptive gaze, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "What's your name?" she asked, changing the subject. "I am Tunu," he replied, "and you are the woman whose healing touch draws its strength from a heart that has been broken and mended."
Over the following days, as Tunu recovered from his injuries, Elisabeth found herself drawn into conversations unlike any she had experienced since Thomas's death. Tunu possessed a combination of wisdom and gentleness that reminded her of the best physicians she had known. But his understanding of healing went beyond anything she had encountered in her formal medical training. "In my culture," Tunu explained, as Elisabeth changed the dressings on his wounds, "we believe that healers are made by their own experiences of pain and loss.
The medicine man who has never suffered cannot truly understand the suffering of others. The healer who has never faced death cannot guide others through the passage between life and death." "But I failed when it mattered most," Elisabeth protested. "I couldn't save the person I loved more than life itself." "Perhaps that person was not meant to be saved by you," Tunu suggested gently. "Perhaps his purpose was to teach you something about the nature of healing that you could not have learned any other way." Elisabeth found herself considering possibilities she had never entertained before. What if Thomas's death hadn't been a sign of her failure as a healer, but rather a necessary part of her development into a different kind of healer? What if the pain and loss she had experienced had actually deepened her ability to connect with patients and understand their needs? As Tunu's physical condition improved, Elisabeth became aware that her own emotional and spiritual healing was progressing as well. The crushing guilt that had dominated her thoughts for 3 years was gradually being replaced by a more nuanced understanding of her role as a healer and the limits of what any one person could accomplish. But she was also becoming aware of something else: her growing feelings for the man she had saved. Tunu possessed a quiet strength and wisdom that drew her like a magnet, and their conversations had awakened intellectual and emotional needs that had been dormant since Thomas's death. Can you imagine finding yourself falling for someone whose life you saved, knowing that your feelings might be clouded by the intense experience of bringing them back from death? "Tell me about your daughter," Elisabeth said one evening as they sat by the fire. "You mentioned her when I first found you." Tunu's face lit up with obvious love and pride. "Kira is 12 years old, wise beyond her years, but still young enough to need guidance. She is staying with her grandmother while I hunt, but winter is coming and they will need the food I was supposed to provide." "What happened to her mother?" Elisabeth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "She died in childbirth," Tunu said quietly. "Like you, I blamed myself for not being able to save someone I loved. Like you, I thought my failure as a protector meant I had no value as a man or as a father." The parallels between their experiences were too obvious to ignore, and Elisabeth felt a connection forming that went beyond the bond between healer and patient. They had both experienced the devastating loss of someone they were supposed to protect. Both struggled with feelings of inadequacy and failure. Both withdrawn from their communities in an attempt to avoid further pain. "How did you get past it?" Elisabeth asked. "I realized that Kira needed her father more than I needed to punish myself for her mother's death," Tunu replied. "And I learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can give to those we have lost is to honor their memory by continuing to live fully and love deeply." Elisabeth felt tears starting in her eyes, the first tears she had shed since Thomas's funeral. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to do that," Tunu said gently. "You are stronger than you know. You proved that when you chose to save my life despite your fear of failure. You proved it when you opened your heart to my pain even though you were protecting yourself from your own." As winter settled over the lake country, Elisabeth and Tunu found themselves sharing not just a cabin, but a deepening emotional connection that surprised them both. Elisabeth had assumed that her capacity for romantic love had died with Thomas, while Tunu had believed that his responsibilities as a single father left no room for personal relationships. But the isolated intimacy of the cabin, combined with the intense experience of his near-death and recovery, created a bond that neither had expected. Elisabeth discovered that it was possible to love again without betraying Thomas's memory, while Tunu learned that opening his heart to another woman didn't diminish his love for his deceased wife. Their relationship developed slowly,
built on mutual respect and understanding rather than the passionate intensity that had marked Elizabeth's relationship with Thomas. When they finally acknowledged their feelings for each other, it felt like a natural progression rather than a dramatic turning point. "I need to return to my daughter soon," Tunu said one snowy evening in December, "but I want you to come with me." Elizabeth felt her heart jump at the suggestion, but also felt the familiar fear that had dominated her life since Thomas's death. "I don't know if I'm ready to be around people who need healing again. What if I fail them the way I failed Thomas?" "Then you will have tried," Tunu replied simply, "and trying is all any of us can do. But Elizabeth, my people need a healer. The old medicine woman died last summer, and there is no one with the knowledge to take her place. Your skills, combined with what I can teach you about our traditional methods, could save many lives." Elizabeth thought about the medical supplies sitting unused in her trunk, about the years of knowledge and experience that were serving no purpose in her isolation. "What about us? What about what's growing between us?" "What's growing between us will grow stronger when it's tested by real life," Tunu said. "Love that can only survive in isolation isn't really love at all. It's just mutual comfort." The decision to leave her cabin and return to a world where her skills as a healer would be needed was one of the most difficult Elizabeth had ever made. But she realized that Tunu was right. Hiding from the possibility of failure meant also hiding from the possibility of success, of making a real difference in people's lives. In February, when the worst of the winter storms had passed, Elizabeth packed her medical supplies and joined Tunu for the journey to his village. The journey back to the world from which she had tried so hard to escape. The trip took them across frozen lakes and through forests where the snow was deeper than Elizabeth's waist, but Tunu's knowledge of Arctic travel kept them safe and warm. Elizabeth's first sight of the Inuit village was unlike anything she had experienced in her years of practicing medicine in white settlements. The community was small, perhaps 50 people, living in traditional structures that seemed to grow organically from the landscape itself. But there was a sense of interconnection and mutual support that was immediately apparent, a feeling that everyone's welfare was everyone's responsibility. Kara proved to be everything her father had said and more. She was a serious, intelligent girl who had clearly inherited both her parents' strength and her father's wisdom. Her initial wariness toward Elizabeth melted quickly when she saw how her father looked at this white woman and how Elizabeth looked back at him. "Are you going to be my new mother?" Kara asked Elizabeth directly during their second day in the village. Elizabeth was startled by the directness of the question, but Tunu just smiled. "My people believe in speaking plainly about important matters," he explained. "Children especially don't see the point in pretending that adults don't have feelings." "I would be honored to be part of your family," Elizabeth told Kara carefully, "but I want you to know that I could never replace your mother or try to make you forget her." "I don't want to forget her," Kara replied, "but I don't want to be without a mother either, and my father has been sad for too long." The integration into the village community proved easier than Elizabeth had expected. The people were initially curious about the white woman who had saved Tunu's life, but they quickly came to appreciate her medical skills and her obvious respect for their customs and traditions. Elizabeth discovered that combining her formal medical training with traditional Inuit healing practices created a powerful synthesis that was more effective than either approach alone. The village elders taught her about medicinal plants and spiritual healing techniques, while she introduced them to surgical procedures and diagnostic methods that expanded their ability to treat serious injuries and illnesses. But more importantly, Elizabeth rediscovered the joy that came from using her skills to help people. Each successful treatment, each life saved, each family kept together by her intervention helped heal the wound that Thomas's death had left in her heart. She began to understand that her husband's death had not been a judgment on her abilities as a healer, but simply one of those tragedies that no amount of skill or love could prevent. The village also benefited from having two healers working together. Tunu's traditional knowledge complemented Elizabeth's modern training, and their personal relationship added a dimension of trust and cooperation that enhanced their effectiveness as a medical team. As spring arrived and the ice began to break up on the lakes,
Elisabeth and Tunu were married in a ceremony that combined elements of both their cultures. The celebration lasted 3 days and drew visitors from neighboring communities who came to witness the union of the white healer and the Inuit hunter who had found love in the aftermath of loss. Their wedding night was spent in a traditional shelter that the village had constructed for them, surrounded by the sounds of the Arctic spring and the knowledge that they had both found something they thought was lost forever: the courage to love again despite the pain that love could bring. In the months that followed, Elisabeth discovered that her healing gift had not only returned, but had grown stronger through her experiences with loss and recovery. Patients who sought her help found that she understood their pain in ways that went beyond medical diagnosis, that her touch carried not just technical skill, but genuine compassion born from her own suffering. She also learned that being part of a family again, even an unconventional family that included a stepdaughter who spoke 3 languages and a husband whose hunting skills were legendary throughout the region, brought joy she had forgotten was possible. Tunu, meanwhile, found that sharing his life with Elisabeth had made him a better father and a more effective member of his community. Her different perspective on problem solving and her extensive knowledge complemented his traditional skills, making them partners in ways that went far beyond their romantic relationship. Kira thrived under the attention of 2 adults who clearly loved both her and each other. She learned medical techniques from Elisabeth while maintaining her connection to traditional Inuit culture through her father, growing into a young woman who could navigate multiple worlds with confidence and skill. The village prospered as well, becoming known throughout the region as a place where people could receive the best possible medical care regardless of their cultural background. Elisabeth's reputation as a healer spread, but now it was enhanced by stories of her personal journey through loss to renewal, making her not just a skilled physician, but a symbol of hope for others who had experienced devastating losses. Years later, Elisabeth watched Kira teaching younger children about medicinal plants while Tunu prepared for a hunting expedition. She often thought about the day she had knelt beside Thomas's grave and believed her life as a healer was over. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone who had understood healing as a technical skill rather than a spiritual calling, someone who had seen failure as a judgment rather than as a teacher. The transformation had not been easy or immediate. Even after her successful treatment of Tunu, Elisabeth had struggled with moments of doubt and fear. There were patients she couldn't save, injuries too severe for any intervention, illnesses that progressed despite her best efforts.
But now, instead of seeing these failures as proof of her inadequacy, she understood them as reminders of the limits that all healers faced. Limits that made their successes more precious rather than their failures more devastating. The village had grown around Elisabeth and Tunu's medical practice, becoming a regional center for healing that drew people from communities hundreds of miles away. Word had spread about the white woman who could set bones with the precision of a surgeon and the Inuit man who could diagnose illness by reading signs in a patient's eyes, about the couple who combined the best of 2 medical traditions to create something more powerful than either could achieve alone. Their reputation had attracted other healers as well: a young Metis woman named Marie who specialized in herbal remedies, an elderly Cree medicine man called Joseph who understood the spiritual dimensions of illness, even a formerly trained physician named Dr. William Chen, who had grown frustrated with the limitations of purely Western medicine and sought to learn from indigenous healing traditions. Elisabeth found herself at the center of a medical community unlike anything that existed elsewhere in the Northern Territories. Patients who came seeking treatment often stayed for weeks, not just to recover from their ailments, but to learn from the healers who had gathered in this remote village. The place had become a kind of informal medical school where knowledge was shared freely between cultures and healing traditions that had been separated by centuries of misunderstanding and conflict. But perhaps more importantly, the village had become a place where broken people could come to heal not just their bodies, but their spirits. Elisabeth wasn't the only one who had found refuge here after experiencing devastating loss. Marie had fled an abusive marriage that had left her physically and emotionally scarred. Joseph had lost his entire family to smallpox and had wandered for years before finding a new purpose in teaching others. Dr. Chen had watched his young son die of an illness he couldn't diagnose, driving him to seek healing methods beyond what he had learned in medical school. Each of these healers brought their own understanding of how personal pain could be transformed into compassion for others, how individual suffering could become a source of strength for serving those in need. The medical practice that Elisabeth and Tunu had established had evolved into something more like a healing community, where wounded healers helped each other while serving the broader population of the region. Kira had grown up in this environment, absorbing knowledge from every healer who passed through the village, while maintaining her deep connection to traditional Inuit culture through her father. At 17, she was already more skilled than many fully trained physicians, with an intuitive understanding of both the science and art of healing that impressed even the most experienced practitioners.
She has the gift, Tunu had said to Elisabeth one evening as they watched Kira successfully treat a complicated fracture that had challenged even Elisabeth's surgical skills. But more than that, she has the wisdom to use it well. Elisabeth had nodded, recognizing in her stepdaughter the same combination of technical skill and spiritual insight that she had spent years trying to develop in herself. But Kira had something else as well, a sense of joy in her work that Elisabeth had lost during her years of grief and was only now beginning to recover. The girl approached healing not as a burden or a test of her worth, but as a privilege and an adventure. She delighted in learning new techniques and solving diagnostic puzzles and finding ways to ease suffering and restore health. Her enthusiasm was infectious, reminding the older healers of why they had chosen this calling in the first place. "I want to study with the healers in the south," Kira announced one spring evening as the family shared dinner around their fire. "Marie says there are medical schools where women can train as physicians, and Dr. Chen thinks I'm ready for formal education." Elisabeth felt a familiar stab of maternal concern mixed with pride. The idea of Kira leaving the safety and familiarity of the village was frightening, but Elisabeth also recognized that the girl's talents deserved the best possible development. "It would mean being away for several years," Tunu said carefully, "and you would be one of the few native women in such schools. The challenges would be significant." "The challenges here are significant too," Kira replied with a smile. "But you and Elisabeth have taught me that the most difficult paths often lead to the most important destinations." Elisabeth recognized her own words being quoted back to her, advice she had given Kira during the girl's earlier struggles with feeling caught between two cultures. The irony wasn't lost on her. The woman who had fled from challenges was now being reminded by her daughter of the importance of embracing them. "If that's what you want, we'll find a way to make it happen," Elisabeth said finally. "But I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that you'll remember that healing is not just about technique or knowledge. The most powerful medicine you'll ever have is your ability to see each patient as a whole person, to understand that every illness has emotional and spiritual dimensions as well as physical ones." "I promise," Kira said solemnly, "and I promise to come back. This will always be my home, and these people will always be my responsibility." The conversation marked another turning point in Elisabeth's understanding of her role as both a healer and a mother. She was learning to let go of the people she loved without abandoning them, to trust in the foundation she had helped provide while accepting that others must make their own choices about how to build upon it. Kira's departure from medical school the following autumn was one of the most difficult experiences Elisabeth had endured since Thomas's death. But it was a different kind of pain, not the crushing despair of unexpected loss, but the bittersweet ache of necessary separation. She was proud of Kira's courage and ambition, while also missing the daily joy of working alongside someone who shared her passion for healing. Tunu understood her struggle in the way that only someone who had experienced similar loss could understand. "She carries the best of both of us with her," he reminded Elisabeth during the long winter evenings when Kira's absence seemed most acute, "and she will come back stronger and more capable than when she left." The letters that arrived sporadically throughout Kira's first year away confirmed Tunu's prediction. The girl was thriving in her studies, while also challenging her professors with perspectives they had never considered. She wrote about introducing traditional diagnostic techniques in her clinical rotations, about teaching fellow students to recognize the emotional components of physical illness, about the ways her unconventional background was making her a more effective healer.
My anatomy professor says I have an unusually intuitive understanding of how the body's systems interconnect, one letter reported. I tried to explain that Inuit healers have always known that everything in the body is connected to everything else, but I don't think he understood that this was not just mystical thinking, but practical knowledge based on centuries of careful observation. Elizabeth smiled as she read this, remembering her own struggles to integrate traditional and modern approaches to medicine. Kira was fighting the same battles, but from a position of strength rather than defensiveness, with the confidence that came from having grown up seeing both approaches prove their value. The village continued to evolve during Kira's absence, attracting new healers and developing new treatment protocols that further enhanced its reputation throughout the region. Elizabeth found herself taking on more of a teaching role, passing on not just medical techniques, but the philosophical approach to healing that had emerged from her own journey through loss and recovery. Healing is not something we do to people, she would tell new practitioners. It's something we do with people, recognizing that every patient is also a teacher who has something to show us about the nature of suffering and recovery. This approach attracted healers who were dissatisfied with the mechanistic view of medicine that dominated formal medical training, practitioners who were seeking a more holistic understanding of their calling. The village became known as a place where healers could heal themselves while serving others, where the wounds that had driven them to medicine could be transformed into sources of wisdom and compassion.
Dr. Chen often remarked that the medical community Elisabeth and Tunu had created represented the future of healing, a synthesis of the best insights from multiple traditions, guided by practitioners who understood that their own struggles with loss and recovery were not obstacles to effective treatment, but essential qualifications for truly serving others. In the medical schools where I trained, he told a group of visiting healers, we were taught to maintain professional distance from our patients, to avoid letting our personal experiences influence our clinical judgment. But here, I've learned that my personal experiences of loss and failure are not liabilities to be overcome, but assets to be cultivated. The physician who has never suffered cannot truly understand suffering. The healer who has never been broken cannot help others put themselves back together. Elisabeth often thought about Dr. Chen's observations when she reflected on her own journey from the depths of grief to her current role as a teacher and mentor to other healers. The woman who had believed her husband's death marked the end of her youthfulness as a physician had discovered that it was actually the beginning of a deeper and more meaningful practice of medicine. The skills she had developed through her own healing process, the ability to sit with suffering without being overwhelmed by it, the capacity to find hope in seemingly hopeless situations, the wisdom to recognize when cure was not possible but comfort still was, had made her a more effective healer than she had ever been when she was focused solely on technical competence. When Kira returned from medical school 3 years later, she brought with her not only formal credentials, but a deepened understanding of how the healing community she had grown up in represented something revolutionary in the practice of medicine. Her thesis had been based on her experiences in the village, documenting the superior outcomes achieved when traditional and modern healing methods were combined with attention to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of illness. I want to establish a formal medical school here, she announced at a community meeting shortly after her return, not to replace what we are already doing, but to give it the recognition and resources it deserves. There are healers throughout the world who would benefit from learning our approaches, and there are patients who could be helped if more physicians understood how to treat the whole person rather than just symptoms. The proposal sparked intense discussion throughout the village. Some worried that formalizing their approach might compromise the spiritual dimensions that made it so effective. Others argued that their methods needed to be documented and taught systematically if they were to influence the broader practice of medicine. Elizabeth found herself torn between these perspectives. Part of her valued the informal, intuitive nature of the healing community they had created, the way wisdom was passed on through experience and relationship rather than through textbooks and lectures. But she also recognized the potential impact that a formal training program could have, the possibility of influencing how healing was understood and practiced throughout the region and beyond. "What do you think?" Tunu asked her one evening as they discussed Kira's proposal. Elisabeth was quiet for a long moment, considering all the implications. "I think," she said finally, "that we have a responsibility to share what we've learned, even if doing so changes what we've built here. The approaches we've developed are too valuable to keep to ourselves, and there are too many people who could benefit from them." The decision to establish the Northern Institute for Integrative Medicine represented another major transition in Elisabeth's life and work. She found herself moving from direct patient care to curriculum development, from treating individual illnesses to training future healers who would carry their approaches to communities throughout the Northern Territories and beyond. The Institute attracted students from across North America and even from Europe, drawn by reports of the remarkable outcomes achieved when patients were treated with attention to emotional and spiritual needs as well as physical symptoms, providing the scientific validation that more conservative medical establishments required. These research findings began to influence medical practice far beyond the boundaries of the village, as physicians throughout the region and beyond sought training in the integrated approaches that the Institute promoted. "We are not training technicians," Elisabeth would tell new classes of students. "We're developing healers, people who understand that medicine is fundamentally about relationship, about the connection between one human being who is suffering and another human being who has the knowledge and compassion to help. The most sophisticated medical techniques in the world are worthless without this fundamental understanding." The Institute also became a research center where the effectiveness of various healing approaches could be documented and studied. Kira led research projects that demonstrated the superior outcomes achieved when patients were treated with attention to emotional and spiritual needs as well as physical symptoms, providing the scientific validation that more conservative medical establishments required. These research findings began to influence medical practice far beyond the boundaries of the village, as physicians throughout the region and beyond sought training in the integrated approaches that the Institute promoted. Elisabeth found herself invited to medical conferences and schools throughout North America, sharing her insights about how personal experience of loss could be transformed into more effective healing practice. But she never forgot the origins of her understanding. The day when a dying Inuit hunter had appeared at her door and challenged her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about healing, failure, and second chances. In every lecture she gave, every student she mentored, every patient she treated, Elisabeth carried forward the lessons she had learned during those crucial months when Tunu's near death had awakened her own capacity for renewal and growth. The cabin by Lake Bennett still stood empty, a reminder of the years she had spent hiding from her own potential. But Elisabeth felt no regret about those lost years. They had been necessary preparation for the life she was living now, just as Thomas's death had been necessary preparation for the depth of compassion she brought to her current work. Visitors to the Institute often remarked on the unusual atmosphere of the place, the sense that healing happened not just in the treatment rooms, but in every interaction, every conversation, every moment of connection between people who understood that suffering and joy were both essential parts of the human experience. Students graduated not just with medical knowledge, but with a transformed understanding of their own purpose and potential. "This place changes people," one visiting physician observed. "Students arrive thinking they want to learn new techniques, but they leave with a completely different understanding of what it means to heal and be healed." Elisabeth smiled when she heard comments like this, recognizing in them the same transformation she had experienced when Tunu first challenged her understanding of failure and success, loss and recovery. The Institute had become what she and Tunu had discovered in their own relationship, a place where broken things could be mended, where apparent endings could become new beginnings, where the deepest wounds could become sources of the greatest strength. As she entered her 60s, Elisabeth often reflected on the unexpected turns her life had taken, the way apparent disasters had become opportunities, the way losses had led to discoveries she could never have imagined. The young woman who had entered medical school believing that healing was about conquering death and disease had evolved into a mature practitioner who understood that healing was about helping people find meaning and peace regardless of their physical outcomes. The Institute continued to grow and evolve, attracting students and patients from around the world while maintaining its deep roots in the remote village where Elisabeth and Tunu have first discovered the power of combining different healing traditions with attention to the whole person.
Kira had taken over much of the day-to-day administration, allowing Elisabeth to focus on the teaching and mentoring work that had become her greatest passion. But the most important measures of Elisabeth's success were not the institute's reputation or the number of students who sought training there. They were the individual lives that had been touched and transformed, the healers who had learned to find strength in their own wounds, the patients who had discovered that healing was possible even when cure was not. Elisabeth Harper had given up her healing gift after her husband's death, believing that her failure to save him proved she had no value as a physician. But when a dying Inuit hunter appeared at her door, she discovered that her greatest strength as a healer came not from her medical knowledge, but from her understanding of what it meant to lose everything and find the courage to begin again. She had learned that second chances were not just possible, but necessary. That the heart's capacity for love was not diminished by loss, but deepened by it. And that the most powerful healing touch was one that had been broken and allowed to mend stronger than before. The woman who had believed her story was over when Thomas died had discovered that it was just beginning, that the most important chapters of her life were still to be written, and that sometimes the greatest gifts came disguised as the most devastating losses. Her healing touch had returned not in spite of her broken heart, but because of it, proving that some things must be lost before they can be truly found.